With the horrific recent massacre at Charleston's historic black church, it seems America is finally waking up to the terrorist demon it has growing in its midst. With the people across the nation slowly becoming alive to this significant and growing threat, it is unclear if the federal agencies created to protect them will follow suit. The long hangover from 9/11 means that domestic agencies, primarily the FBI and Department of Homeland Security, which was created post 9/11, are still focusing on Islamic terrorism as the main terrorist threat. They are ignoring the burgeoning white supremacist and neo-Nazi movement, which sees violent racial holy war, or what they call Rahowa, as the only redemptive cause for America. As the New York Times recently documented, since September 11, 2001, nearly twice as many people have been killed by white supremacists, anti-government fanatics and other non-Muslim extremists than by radical Muslims. 48 have been killed by extremists who are not Muslim, compared with 26 by self-proclaimed jihadists. Part of the reason that the authorities' stare has remained fixed on Islamic fundamentalism is political correctness. It has been impossible to raise the issue of white supremacist terrorism and violence, especially in the military and among the veteran community, without it being presented as an attack on all white Americans or all US servicemen. The mainstream US media seems to balk at calling massacres, like the one in Charleston, the terrorism it clearly is, choosing instead to call it a lone wolf attack, as shown here by the USA Today, the LA Times, and the Washington Post. The press needs to overcome this fear and call it what it is. But it's not just the media. Some of America's most vaunted institutions have been helping to incubate this threat. I spent a number of years investigating how neo-Nazis and white supremacists had infiltrated the US military with very little pushback from the Pentagon. They were desperate to keep the supply of troops flowing for the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. I wrote an article for Salon.com about neo-Nazis in the army. I spoke to veterans who had been radicalized before service and joined to get access to weapons and training. I also spoke to veterans who had been radicalized when back from war. Forrest Fogarty was an Iraq war veteran who had been a Nazi since he was 14 years old. He had a well-documented history of violence. He told me, "I hate Arabs more than anybody for the simple fact I've served over there and seen how they live. They're just a backward people. Them and the Jews are just disgusting people as far as I'm concerned. Their customs, everything to do with the Middle East, is just repugnant to me." Fogarty made no attempt to hide his racism, covering his body with racist tattoos. He had a Viking carrying a staff, an icon among white nationalists, on his arm. Emblazoned across his stomach, he had a Celtic cross, an Irish symbol appropriated by neo-Nazis. Racist tattoos remain one of the clearest indicators of extremism, and the US military requires recruits to explain any tattoos, as I described in an article for The Guardian. He said that the military just told him to write an explanation of each tattoo, and he made up some stuff, and that was that. Fogarty was in the army for 8 years. Civil rights organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center warned about hate groups infiltrating the military. This was reported by the New York Times and the Washington Post. But despite the widespread message, it was dutifully ignored and attacked by the military and its supporters. Charles Wilson, spokesman for the white supremacist, homophobic and anti-Semitic National Socialist movement, told me quite openly about his attempts to populate the US Armed Forces with extremists, as I reported in another piece for The Guardian. He told me that we do encourage them to sign up for the military. We can use the training to secure the resistance to our government. Our military doesn't agree with our political beliefs. They are not supposed to be in the military, but they're there in ever greater numbers. He claimed to have 190 members serving. I also spoke to Dennis Mahon, another lone wolf white supremacist who was sentenced to 40 years in 2012 for a bombing he carried out which injured a Black City official. He told me that the military are so desperate at the moment they are going to let you in with a small swastika. If you're an obvious racist, you might find it difficult, but generally you are fine. Essentially, they want guys that want to kill. In Iraq, you don't know who your enemies are. There's no front line. But he believes this new liberalism will come back to haunt the authorities. The soldiers learned from unconventional warfare in Iraq, and they realized that they can use that type of warfare in America, and it's impossible to stop. I tell people to learn as much as you can to improve munitions capabilities. I want them to learn sniping and explosives. There's been no shortage of official government reports attesting to the fact that white supremacists are present within the US military. In 2006, the National Gang Intelligence Center, which integrates gang intelligence across agencies, noted that various white supremacist groups have been documented on military installations both domestically and internationally. Neo-Nazis, according to one analyst, stretch across all branches of service. They are linking up across the branches once inside, and they are hardcore. Recruitment flyers imploring soldiers to fight for a white nation in the coming race war were discovered on Fort Carson in Colorado, as shown here in the Army Times. The flyers urge the soldiers to help secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. In white supremacist incidents from 2001 to 2008, the FBI identified 203 veterans. Most of them were associated with the National Alliance and the National Socialist Movement. In 2009, the Department of Homeland Security released a report that analyzed the possible recruitment and radicalization of returning veterans by extremist groups. The Washington Times warned of radicals on the right, and even Fox News reported on the rise of right-wing extremism. The report noted that the return of military veterans facing significant challenges reintegrating into their communities could lead to the potential emergence of terrorist groups or lone wolf extremists capable of carrying out violent attacks. Predictably, it was attacked by right-wing politicians and commentators. Right-wing blogger and Fox News pundit Michelle Malkin called it one of the most embarrassingly shoddy pieces of propaganda I'd ever read, and anti-military bigotry. It was presented as a liberal attack on the brave fighting men and women of the United States, or as Malkin put it, an Obama Department of Homeland Security hit job on conservatives. The data is there, but the media continue to ignore the deep-rooted problems within the US military because this story so glaringly contradicted the fairy tale narrative of the war on terror. Individual massacres and atrocities were covered to the point of saturation, but the context was always missing. It was also inconceivable that people who had been at the top of government and turned a blind eye, people like former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, might share some blame. Perhaps this is why there is such surprise every time there is a violent attack. Americans are inevitably told it's an outlier, not the product of a US military that allows extremism and ignores its marginalized veterans. The longer that debate is pushed off the table, the worse the problem will become, and the worse the resulting violence. In the spring of 2014, 3 people were murdered in an anti-Semitic attack near Kansas City. Just days after this, the New York Times broke the mold and bravely printed a stinging op-ed that highlighted the problem of radicalized soldiers and veterans. Its author, Kathleen Belew, a doctoral student working on a book on Vietnam and the far right, explained, "When Frazier Glenn Miller shot and killed 3 people in Overland Park, Kansas, he did so as a soldier of the white power movement, a groundswell that united Klansmen, neo-Nazis and other fringe elements after the Vietnam War," stating that it remains a diminished but potent threat today. She asked, would Miller have received greater scrutiny had he been a Muslim, a foreigner, not white, not a veteran? The answer is clear and alarming. She was subjected to a torrent of abuse for impugning the whole veteran community, something she actually went to great pains to avoid. It was a standard tactic used to shut down debate on the topic and entirely predictable. In a statement posted by the American Legion, National Commander Daniel Dellinger called it a poorly researched and agenda-driven piece, adding that the New York Times should be above the slanderous stereotyping of the men and women that have defended us against the racist ideology that Miss Belew and the New York Times no doubt oppose. During my research, I met a number of outspoken analysts who worked on the threat posed by radicalized US veterans, but many went quiet after they were victims of similar smear campaigns. Darrell Johnson, a senior analyst at the DHS and one of the bravest whistleblowers, was crushed for his warning of the threat of white supremacist extremism and its potential to blossom in the veteran community, as reported here by Wired. Most Americans to this day are still not aware of the number of military-trained white supremacists who are settling back in their communities, largely because of the marginalization of anyone who is raising the alarm. Law enforcement needs to be able to discuss where the threats lie and the real significance of these militants without being accused of being unpatriotic, anti-military, and all the rest. One crucial step is accepting that a white supremacist, racist teenager born and bred in the United States is as capable of extremist terrorism as a brown Islamic fundamentalist teenager born and bred in Afghanistan. If the US government wants to get serious about taking on white supremacist terrorism, it must first get serious about the problem in the military and commit to kicking them out of the institution. Since the war on terror and the financial crisis, the white supremacist and neo-Nazi movements have enjoyed a resurgence. And this is a threat that has been grown within some of the most respected institutions within American society, primarily the US military. The terrorist threat in the US is real, and it's not primarily Islamic. Until this is recognized, the threat will grow and more attacks will be inevitable. When a terrorist attack in Paris saw the death of journalists, the world's media went into overkill mode. "We are all Charlie Hebdo," they chanted. But the Charleston killings have been cordoned off. Are Black lives lost not as important? Is it that homegrown terrorism of white fanatics is best left to the United States?